The lenticular stereoscope is a device invented by an Englishman, Sir William Brewster, in 1850. It was refined into its most efficient form by Harvard University professor Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1859 and has been used virtually unchanged ever since. This simple yet efficient device is used to view a stereograph, also known as stereogram or stereo view. That is, a double photo or a printed image paired so that through the lenses it appears as a solid three-dimensional image. No one knows how many different stereo views were made and sold commercially, to say nothing of the amateur ones. However, there were about 12,000 professional stereo photographers in the U.S. by 1890, and there were 50 companies known to have produced at least 10,000 views each. Probably it would not be an exaggeration to say that a reasonable figure is 5 million different views. The earliest stereo views were made on glass plates, such as this view of Sumatra. Obviously, these were fragile and few survive today. Glass views were in common use from about 1850 to 1875. Another early type of view was known as the tissue, represented here by a view of Switzerland. This is a thin paper view, often pierced with small holes to represent lights, windows, and doors. The tissues were mostly foreign and were made from about 1858 to 1875. Beginning in 1852, some views were made on cards that were 7 inches long but only 4 inches high, as in this one of Yosemite's Vernal Falls. This was the size best suited for the stereoscope and was soon adopted as a standard by most manufacturers. Large views known as cabinet cards were introduced in 1873 and made for about 10 years. As this view of Watkins Glen in New York shows, cabinet cards were 7 inches long by 5 inches high. By the late 1870s, curved cards came into common use and were used by virtually all manufacturers by the turn of the century. The curve was believed to heighten the stereo image. Historians usually need to know the date of any view they are working with, and some, like this view of Promontory Point, Utah, are undated. However, dates can often be established through the size of the card, type of corners, color of card mount, or name and address of the photographer. Fortunately for researchers, many views do bear dates, especially those made from the 1870s through the 1910s. During this time, they were copyrighted and registered with the U.S. government. Most paper views produced up through the 1880s, such as this one of the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, Florida, were on colorful pastel cards. Sometimes the front and back were different colors. As this view of the Delaware Water Gap shows, by 1900s most views were appearing on gray cards. The industry had been taken over by a few very large companies, and they standardized one color. Around 1900, box sets became very popular. They were often travelogue sets, such as a tour of a place like Yellowstone Park, or an event like the World's Fair, or even a several hundred view tour of the world. This view of Rock Creek Park in the District of Columbia demonstrates another method of production. Printed views were made by lithograph or offset process from 1853 to 1890 and by half-tone printings after 1898. They range in quality from good to terrible. Even the bad ones may have historical value, though, as sometimes no photographic view was made of the same scene or event. As this view of Washington's Lake Chelan shows, some printed cards were colored, but there were no mass-produced colored photo views. Color film was not invented until after stereo views had died out. However, some photo views were nicely hand-tinted. Most views were commercially produced, but many amateurs also made views. In 1860, a person with $40 could buy a camera, 10 lessons in its use, and the production of 24 views. Amateur views are generally unique and can have considerable historical value. Many photographers in small towns did custom work, and they often advertised on the back of their cards. This one by landscape photographer L.L. Crosthwaite is an example. Earlier cards may have hand-printed titles on paper labels on the back, implying that they were produced in relatively small numbers. This card by Anderson and Ennis of Richmond is an example. In the 1800s, photographers often listed on their cards other views they had for sale. This is helpful to the modern researcher trying to find out what subjects were photographed. By the late 1800s, some of the large companies listed the title of their views on the back in several languages: English, French, German, Spanish, Swedish, and Russian. Some of the early views have an informative or descriptive message on the back. However, researchers must be cautious because these occasionally contain major errors of fact. By the 20th century, the majority of views were being sold to schools, public libraries, and other educational institutions. Keystone, the last and largest manufacturer, printed informative backs on many of their cards. Often the tone of the text makes it obvious that it was written for children. Some views that were mass-produced are very common even today. This view of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone was printed and reprinted over 20 years, and today is the most often encountered scene of a national park. Other views, such as this one of Montezuma Well in Arizona by D.P. Flanders, are rare or even unique. Here are a few of the different topics that can be found in stereo views, listed alphabetically and beginning with this view of the Alaska Gold Rush, taken at Chilkoot Pass in 1898. Views exist with an astronomy theme, including this 1891 view of the moon, photographed by a noted astronomer named Rutherford. Views of buildings, both public and private, exist in great variety. Here's an 1870s advertisement for a model house in Waterbury, Vermont. Cave scenes are common, beginning with Charles Waldeck's pioneering efforts in Mammoth Cave in 1866. The Victorian interest in death caused cemeteries to be photographed in profusion. This 1891 view of Minister Henry Ward Beecher's grave in Greenwood Cemetery, Brooklyn. City views can often be found. This scene of San Francisco's Market Street was taken in 1901 before the earthquake that destroyed most of the city. Newspapers of the day did not print photographs, so stereo views provided information about disasters such as the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania in 1889. Expositions and fairs were popular during the heyday of stereo views, as this 1893 view of the Columbian Exposition in Chicago attests. Floral views were popular with the Victorians. A photographer in Port Edward, New York, immortalized Mrs. Putnam's Moss Temple. Foreign views were sold in great quantities by both the U.S. and overseas companies. This German view shows a tourist from that country in Nagasaki, Japan. Humor was a favorite subject, and sets of several views were produced to tell comical stories. A husband's relationship with his mother-in-law was one popular theme. Closely related were the sentimental views, which often depicted children, pets, or family scenes. Industrial views are often found, documenting textile mills, printing presses, and auto assembly lines, as well as eastern oil fields. Mining views detail operations to extract various products in a number of different states, but the Pennsylvania coal mines were probably the most often photographed. Native Americans were of great interest to some stereo photographers. This view is of Hopis at Shongopavi, Arizona in 1908. There are many views of parks, some of which had that designation when they were photographed, and others which came later. Casa Grande National Monument in Arizona was not authorized until more than 10 years after this view of it was made. Stereo views captured many of the personalities of the day. Although President Theodore Roosevelt was extensively photographed in stereo, there were relatively few views of his daughter Alice. Recreation is the subject of some views, including mountain climbing, picnicking, horseback riding, and as seen here, seaside bathing. Statuary is often seen in stereo views, both monumental pieces and smaller varieties such as the Rogers Group shown here. Unknown views are those which their makers or owners never bothered to label. They can sometimes be identified through research, but in the case of this private home, we can only speculate when and why it was taken. The wars of the era were well documented too. This view taken of Spotsylvania Courthouse in Virginia is typical of Civil War views. Zoological views are also common, such as the series of stuffed birds and animals made by James Hurst in 1870. This one is of bufflehead ducks, but his most interesting card shows passenger pigeons, which are now extinct. The ways in which historians can use stereo views are many and varied, and there are obvious applications to cultural history. For example, a view such as this one of the poet Longfellow's home taken while he lived there can be used as a source of information to restore the exterior of a building to a certain period. When efforts began a few years ago to restore the Statue of Liberty, this 1876 stereo view made at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia helped to establish what the original appearance of the torch had been. Stereo views can provide documentation of the furnishings of historic houses. This view of the entrance hall at Sagamore Hill reveals how President Roosevelt's home appeared in 1904. Stereo views can be used as an aid in providing generic furnishings for rooms in historic buildings, and as this 1909 scene illustrates, the stereoscope itself would often be an appropriate item. A generic scene like that of the old carpenter can provide information about tools and how they were used. The appearance of military uniforms and accoutrements is documented by views such as this one of the 10th Pennsylvania Regiment during the Spanish-American War. Care to know what the common folk were wearing on the Midway at the Columbian Exposition? A stereo view can tell you. Or, how about what the well-dressed tourist was wearing to visit Bryce Canyon National Park in the 1920s? Again, a view gives the answer. Perhaps you might want to research a technique once used. For example, how did people climb mountains at the turn of the century? This view of Mount Rainier in Washington reveals part of the answer. Okay. Stereo views can shed light on what happened at specific events of historical interest. A great deal can be learned by studying this view of the dedication of Grant's tomb in New York City in 1897. Views can be used in natural history research as well. Recently, the staff at Yosemite National Park used views like this one to determine changes in the valley's vegetation over the past century. A similar use was made of views by an ecology professor at South Dakota State University. He first looked at views taken by the Custer expedition to the South Dakota Black Hills in 1874, including this one of the rock formation known as Pulpit Knob. He relocated the photo points and took new photos on the same day of the year and at the same time of day as the originals. Here is Pulpit Knob, 98 years after the Custer expedition saw it, and with a much thicker growth of pines. Erosion of geological formations can be measured by comparing old and new views. Here is Castle Rock in Minnesota as it looked in the 1870s. And this is Castle Rock after approximately 80 years of weathering of its soft sandstone. In the 1960s, the staff at Carlsbad Caverns National Park was studying the changes in cave climate caused by visitation. They used old stereo views to measure the changes in depth of the Green Lake and other pools. Another use of views that has been made at caves is to determine the growth rates of formations that were photographed years ago. This view of green turtles being loaded at Key West, Florida in the 1920s has been used in interpretive programs on biodiversity and endangered species. There are still other applications to cultural interpretation. Information about specific people can be derived from views. Interpreters at Sagamore Hill National Monument have used this view when discussing Theodore Roosevelt's son Quentin, who died in aerial combat in France in World War I. One of the most common uses for views is the Then and Now exhibit to show how things have changed or remained the same. Here is an 1880s view of John Merrill, known as the philosopher of the pool, in New Hampshire's White Mountains. On the rock behind him are paintings depicting his theory of a hollow earth. A recent photo taken of the pool, now part of Franconia Notch State Park, shows that Merrill's paintings are still visible after more than 100 years. Here is the Then and Now series of the famous elm tree on Cambridge Common, where legend has George Washington taking command of his troops. This view dates from 1875. By 1983, the background was still much the same, but the original elm had died and been replaced in a different location by a clone. Exhibits demonstrating changes in technology and quality of life can be augmented by views such as this one of Thomas Circle in Washington, D.C. An exhibit on the continuity of the use of sites and structures could be formulated using views like this one of Wall Street, Federal Hall, and Trinity Church in New York City in 1895. An exhibit on the changes of usage of structures could be done through such views as those of Castle Clinton in New York City, which was at various times a fort, a theater, an immigration center, and an aquarium. In summary, stereoscope views are a window on the past, bringing us closer to people, places, and events long gone. Their uses in interpretation are limited only by the bounds of our imagination.